Dan Gallagher is driven by the notion that life is too short to build products people won't use. After 30 years, as seen as a product designer, product manager, product owner, agile team member, productive executive, product consultant, and even as a scrum master, he has battled on the ground, led from the trenches, fought through the middle, and surveyed from the above. And above all, he is my colleague at Slalom. Becky is a senior consultant at the Agile practice in Slalom. Becky created and leads our product owner coaching offering at Slalom, which empowers and supports for product owners struggling in the role or new to the role to build better products. Prior to joining Slalom, Becky worked as a product owner for nearly 8 years, mostly in financial services, and she holds an MBA in strategy and innovation from Boston University.
First of all, thank you, Pepe, for pulling this all together. And thank you, everyone, for taking some time this evening. Is the Menti code up again right now?
Yep.
Okay. So really quickly, my journey here tonight started in the late 1990s when I saw Jared Spool. Some might remember him from User Experience Engineering. He now is running the Center for User Experience. He told an analogy when I saw him speak in the late 1990s, which is basically a plane takes off from New York and flies to LA. That plane actually pings LA every 3 seconds to adjust course. And because of winds and external factors, it actually is blown off course continually. So it adjusts and re-steers every 3 seconds. And because of that, it's able to arrive in LA within a very predictable amount of time. But if you actually calculate the amount of time it was off course 97% of the time. But because it continually pinged where it was going and adjusted, it flew in a tiny saw blade pattern across the US, versus if it pinged it every hour, it would fly out towards Canada, then back towards Mexico and back and forth. So this constant feedback from its destination always stuck with me. I didn't know what to do with it, to be honest with you. I was a product manager. I moved from product design. But I always felt there's a powerful lesson there. And it didn't really come together until I read the Agile Manifesto a few years later, and began thinking about what it had to offer and what it said through the lens of what I'd always thought about product discovery and the lesson from Jared Spool's analogy. But what the reality today is, if you step back, it's estimated that $457 billion were spent in IT software development in 2019. So the portion, this is a couple different studies. Tom Poppendijk did a study. Others have done studies. They all fall in the same range. About 64% of products and features, software products and features, are seldom or never used. Rarely or never used. If you add seldom to that list, it's pushing 80%. So if you look at the 64% of the 457 billion, we're talking about over $250 billion spent on software in 2019 that never should have been built at all, which is kind of an amazing stat when you think about it. So we really looked at it, we wanted to understand why that was. I spent a lot of time looking at this and thinking about it and understanding it. And one of the things we noticed is if you kind of look at a high-level value stream of software development, someone has an idea, there's a vision, some kind of plan is developed, there's a design, something is delivered, there's a deployment of some sort, a validation, and a launch. And then voila, there's an outcome for the users. What agile transformations tend to focus on is delivery. The whole aspect of inspect and adapt and adjust rapidly really happens at the delivery stage. All the other key elements of the value stream tend to be left out. What we really started looking at is how do you apply the methodology, the methods of Agile throughout the entire value stream? How do you drive from vision to launch? How do you plan, design, and deliver and deploy and validate in a way that you continually iteratively learning. And what we're going to talk about tonight is really, personally for me, 25 years of exploration that have really accelerated in the past few years as I've worked with a lot of different clients through Slalom to really help them drive a product mindset and figure out how they can leverage Agile to actually build the right thing. Because the pace of Agile can be a powerful asset when it's properly applied in product discovery. One of the things to think about, and one of the things we really looked at, was the idea of an outcome. And rather than start with an idea, is to start with that outcome and make that the focus. And we'll talk more about this. I laugh because in 1992, Stephen Covey wrote 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And I think it was habit 2 was begin with the end in mind. And that's really what we're talking about here. It's let's start with a true understanding of where we want to end up. Let's start with an understanding of what the outcome is that we want for our users. Because as a product person, it's tough to understand in the beginning, but the bottom line is people aren't using your product because they want to use your product. They're using it because they want an outcome that will benefit them. And if your product fails to deliver that outcome, they're going elsewhere. If someone else comes up with a product that delivers that outcome easier, they'll go there. It's about the outcome, not the product. So first of all, what is the product mindset? Hendrik Nyberg, a lot of you may be familiar with him. He did a lot of really good stuff around Agile and product ownership. Did a video on product ownership about 6 or 7 years ago. He does these great kind of hand sketching as he narrates. He did a product owner one, and in it, off to the side, he scribbled this Venn diagram, which always stuck with me. Build the right thing, build the thing right, build the thing fast. And in it, he talks about how to balance. You need to balance those things and what happens in the overlapping circles and things like that. I really looked at this and started really trying to apply it at different organizations, different clients when I was in industry and since I've become a consultant. And there's one thing I found is, number one, viewing it through this lens is a really powerful way to view it. And number two, Nyberg's advice about trying to find the balance is really difficult and misleading. Because when you start to strike a balance between things like this, it starts to break down. So if you want to, balance implies I take from one and give to another. So build the thing fast. Well, do I take from that and slow down to build the right thing? Actually, building things fast can drive faster feedback loops, help guide you to continually build the right thing. So it's not so much about balancing these three, it's getting them to seamlessly flow together. So what we started looking at was, let's take a different lens on this, right? Let's look at build the thing fast and build the thing right. There's really powerful methodology, which you all know well, which is Agile. Agile is really focused in these 2 areas. Now, some would say, actually, our Agile transformation only focused on building it fast, not building the thing right. But it's a really key part of it. So if we start to look at these as through the pairs of not balance, but as beginnings of a cycle, build the thing fast and build the right thing really flow together. Because if we're delivering continually and we're learning from that, then it's going to help guide us, much like that airplane constantly pinging LA and adjusting its course. It's important that we constantly get feedback on what is being built, whether it's a high fidelity, low fidelity, it doesn't matter. True learning, I'm not against product research up front and things like that, but true learning begins when something is built. Users have trouble bridging the gap between, asking theoretical questions. It's getting down to specifics that they can really respond to. So if you look at Agile delivery and continuous discovery, the third piece of that cycle is validated learning. So if we're continually delivering with Agile, and we're doing it in a way we're continuously learning, continuously discovering, what are we doing on the right track? Let's test. What adjustments do we make? Pivot, pause, proceed. We're validating it. We're driving back into what's delivered next. And that's really the foundation of the product mindset. So what we want to talk about tonight is how you do that. And there's really 7 steps behind it. So back to this, this value stream for a second. If this is a cycle, what Amazon proved, they have what's called the Amazon flywheel. It's the idea of how the steps in their process, that's the core of their business. Each step in the process isn't a handoff, it's a cycle that one step drives to the next, drives to the next, drives to the next. And the way you kind of make this a flywheel is you remove the friction. So how do you remove the friction that stops this cycle from continually turning and gaining its own momentum? So back to this diagram, there's really 3 things that we focus on. The first one is to focus on outcomes over outputs. And we're going to double click pretty deep on this in a minute. But the idea that, back to what I said earlier, users aren't using your product to use your product. They're using it because they want an outcome. We need to focus on that outcome. Your business is investing in the product because it wants an outcome. We need to put the focus on that outcome, not on what the next delivery is or what the next release is. They'll always be there. The value of those releases is how they contribute to the outcomes that users expect, that the business needs. So we're going to look at aligning through outcomes. The second piece is, once we've aligned through outcomes, how do we call it embrace uncertainty? How do we iterate towards those outcomes? General Patton once said that if you tell people where to go but not how to get there, you'll be amazed at the results. And he's probably one of the first agilists, because really what we're talking about is, let's align on outcomes. Let's make sure we're all clear on the outcomes we need to bring about. And then let's all agree that we don't know how to make them happen. But we have tight iterative circles, usually 2 weeks, and we can iterate and continually learn within those cycles. We're going to use this concept of embracing the uncertainty to develop experimentation. A platform of experimentation can continually evolve towards the outcomes. And that enables autonomy. So really what we're talking about as outcomes over outputs gives us the alignment. Embracing uncertainty gives us a autonomy within the confines of alignment. And it's really that the last piece of friction is how we continually nurture those 2 things together, because they can continually pull apart. So I had mentioned 7 steps towards this. And this isn't like we set out to create 7 steps. It is trial and error. Having done it initially in industry over decades, and then accelerated in the past few years with many different clients in many, many different industries. But we start at the lower left with outcomes over outputs. In step 1, it's about identifying and building consensus around outcomes. Now, I saw in the Menti we did earlier that there is seemingly somewhat comfort with outcomes overall. What we find is, even when companies talk about outcomes and talk in that vein, building outcomes in a way that can drive alignment through the organization is usually still something that needs to be worked on. It's just not as easy to think about outcomes, and we'll get into exactly how do you do that. Outcomes that can be driven all the way down to the team level, that will actually influence what a developer sitting writing code is actually doing for that day, for that sprint, for that particular task, for that particular story. So what is an outcome? I'm actually a Forrester alum, so I kind of stole their definition. I actually think it's one of the better ones. It's an achieved end state that can be verified through measurable results. Yes, it can be measured. I'll add to that, it usually is not something physical. It's the idea of, and we'll get to what they are, but customer satisfaction. You can't hold customer satisfaction in your hand, but it's an achieved outcome that a product can enable. It's tied to a funded top level initiative. It matters. It's this outcome. An outcome that doesn't really impact our business or our users is not really an outcome we care much about. So it's really tied to a top level of initiative. It's important that it's defined through the lens of those ultimately accountable, right? In Patton's analogy, the definition or the destination was kind of defined, but the pathway to that destination was really defined by the people on the journey. It's colored by the interests of related stakeholders, right? It's not dictated by stakeholders, but it's influenced heavily by them. And then, of course, it's reached over time. It's not like, bang, we're here. We get move closer to it, we adjust, we move closer to it, we adjust. Maybe we move a little further away, we have to readjust a little bit more. So some examples of outcomes, and I've really broken them through my lens, it's 3 categories. There could be more. I haven't done a big scientific deep dive, but they tend to be outcomes of value creation. Things like deeper user engagement. So if you're creating a powerful outcome for the user, then you're gonna have more engagement. You're gonna have increased retention rates, higher acquisition rates, customer loyalty, things like that. Outcomes of value capture. I like to view it through this lens. So that's increased revenue, profitability, that type of thing. If you focus on the left, on the outcomes of value creation, your outcomes of value capture gets significantly easier, significantly. And then there's outcomes of efficiency, reducing costs, better operational alignment, things like that. So some kind of examples of outcomes that we've kind of collected through various clients. This is actually, I've worked in many industries. I go fairly deep in healthcare. So this is a healthcare example where, increasing clinical effectiveness of a particular product, increasing how deep the products goes into the enterprise, increasing international growth. Now, each one of these would have a half dozen plus sub-outcomes, and then cascading downward from there, more and more sub-outcomes and so forth, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a second. But it's understanding and identifying and building consensus around those outcomes is really the starting point. Step 2, communicating through outcomes. So I'm going to kind of jump right into it. If we kind of look at some of the stuff that we just talked about. So if we're looking at an overall outcome of clinical practice, enabling better clinical outcomes, that'll break down to a few, maybe half dozen or so annual outcomes. And those break down into, say, a half dozen plus for each one sub-outcomes. Now, this is a real world example that's been anonymized to protect the innocent, but this is from a client. What we coached them on was going beyond just understanding the overall outcome, the annual outcome, the sub-outcome, but how to carry those through at the epic level, down to the story level. And what we did was we talked to them about, the epics, the stories, they have a so that statement, right? My father once said to me, whenever anyone uses the word but in a sentence, ignore everything that came before it. So if someone says to me, Dan, you're a nice guy, but I'm going to ignore that first part, because what really matters comes after the word but. What really matters in an epic or a story is what comes after the so that statement. So if we look at the epic, the burden of managing users in 2 systems is reduced and delayed in the recycling if unused license, blah, blah, blah. That's the outcome, the sub outcome they're looking for. What happens in the red, something in the red, that's the projected output that may or may not deliver that outcome. But because we're embracing uncertainty, because we're going to be experimenting, we're going to understand and evolve to see if there's a way to do that better brings about the outcome. The same at the story level, projecting an outcome so that a new user account can quickly be reassigned to a new user. So there's an assumption here that user licensing and managing licensing is going to increase customer satisfaction, right? We need to set about how do we do that, and how do we validate that along the way and make sure that we're doing it. And it's really these sub outcomes at that level, at the story level, which start to build upon towards the overall epic. And it's this hierarchy of outcomes management which really helps teams understand what are the overall outcomes. They look at a story, they should quickly understand what outcome the business needs. Becky, did you want to add to this?
Yeah, and so, what Dan's saying here is in every step, an important concept is why. And often what we see when we go into clients is that there's pretty generic, non-specific outcomes like customer satisfaction or operational efficiencies. And without the why behind that, it could really mean anything. And this leads squads across the organization to be misaligned. So as a result, you have teams who are creating stories and epics and sub outcomes where they're spending countless of hours trying to retrofit that to fit these nebulous outcomes, these nebulous, client satisfaction or operational efficiencies, and then they're potentially building the wrong thing. And so instead of wasting time around that, having these at the organizational level, having these specific whys with your outcomes is really helpful for the teams to make sure that they're aligning organizationally to the direction that the organization is looking to go into.
Thanks, Becky. So really, the step 3 kind of rounds out the idea of putting outcomes over outputs, and it's about identifying success through lagging indicators. Now, in step 6, we're going to talk about leading indicators, so we'll bring a little more context to that. But lagging indicators are really important from the perspective of outcomes because they actually are the only way to measure outcomes. Because outcomes are really they're measured through lagging indicators, because when the product is in the market, are you measuring that? That's the only time you can truly know, are you producing the outcomes that matter, right? Deeper user engagement, increased revenue, profitability through higher retention, reduced costs. These are the key things. In healthcare, we had a lot of lagging indicators that had to do with successful patient outcomes, a really powerful idea that we could measure to see if a product was truly driving the value we had expected in the market. So it's how you really understand, are we driving value in the market? We're going to revisit this in a few minutes around lagging indicators through the lens of leading indicators as well. But it's important as part of step 3 that we round it out with saying, all right, we're focused on outcomes, we're identifying them, we're communicating, and we know how we're going to measure them. So then, I mentioned, Stephen Covey earlier in 7 Habits. I'm probably a kind of a bigger fan than most people of that. But the first 3 habits were about the person. How do you, what are the habits you need to do within yourself to be more effective? The second 3 were how you relate to the world, right? So these first 3 are about outcomes. How do we create alignment through the outcomes? Next 3 is how do we then experiment our way through to those outcomes? So step 4 is, first of all, understanding and identifying assumptions. We talked at the beginning about 64% or up to 80% of features are seldom or never used. There's one reason for that. They were based on assumptions that were wrong. That were assumptions that were never validated or invalidated. So that is really the key thing through this next phase, which is let's isolate, understand what assumptions we're dealing with, and how do we validate or invalidate them quickly. So what is an assumption, right? It's something that's believed to be true without any direct evidence, right? It's our best guesses of what's known. It's a critical starting point. You really need to make assumptions to start, but they are deadly, absolutely deadly if you're wrong. I talked about Jared Spool in the late 1990s. I mean, up until that point, I was a product manager who just went on assumptions, got some validation, some research, wrote a spec, threw it over the wall, and it was developed. There were a lot of assumptions I had no idea even existed. I just assumed that I was right, or certainly the team assumed that I was right. Little did they know how off I was. So let's kind of double click on assumptions. There are really 3 types. There's assumptions around desirability. Do they want this? Viability. Should we do this? Does it make sense for us to do this? And feasibility. Can we do this? There is an innate hierarchy in these 3. Desirability first, because if it's not desirable, it doesn't matter if it's viable or feasible. No one's going to want it. So it's really important to view that way, right? If it's desirable and it's viable, maybe it's not feasible. If it's desirable, if it's desirable but not viable, then it doesn't matter if it's feasible. So it's really looking at it through the lens of this. There's a 4th one that has to do with, is it part of your brand? They should, companies like Apple and things like that, should they do things that will be decided also by, is it strengthen their brand? But to keep it simple, we'll focus on these 3. So another real world example, working with a healthcare client, we're going to PI a quarterly plan to map out what was going to happen for an entire quarter. And one of the epics they chose, they were looking to focus on was this one with all the colors in it. And I asked a simple question. I said, there's 4 assumptions in this one epic. How positive are these assumptions? What evidence do you have these assumptions are real? They had none, absolutely none. Yet they were about to, I think, commit 25 to 30 teams to develop against these epics. So it was a real eye-opening experience when they looked at it and said, yeah, we actually aren't sure. The first one in yellow, where users understood syncing users want the ability to sync users in the hospital system. They didn't have any evidence. And so there was a desirability factor back then on this one. And what this call out is saying, which is an important thing to mention, is that when you think about desirability, try to go after the migraines, not the headaches. People are very motivated to cure a migraine. Headaches they can deal with. Migraines, they need a solution for it. So look at from a desirability to, is it a headache or is it a migraine? Because that's going to really go back to the outcomes we talked about, outcomes of value capture. If it's a migraine, the value you're capturing is going to be much, much higher. So we need to validate the assumptions that we're laying out here. Another quick example. This was actually a real one, Dropbox, 2008-ish. I can't remember the exact time frame of this. But when they set out, they looked at the world through this lens. Should we even build Dropbox? Some of the questions are on desirability. People have multiple devices. Do they? Yes. 2008 wasn't it wasn't ubiquitous. People were just starting to get devices that could actually handle files. Number 2, people want access to the same files across those devices. Again, a big question back then. People want those files to stay synced. Another big question. Viability. Will people download the Dropbox on multiple devices? Will they trust it with the data? Will they understand how Dropbox folders work, right? And then you get into the feasibility side, which is a whole other matter. But they asked these questions, and they knew their assumptions, and they sought to validate or invalidate them as quickly as possible before they spent too much time. This is actually, I'll just go through this one quickly, but this is an example that I lived through, where we were looking to create a product within the EMR or EHR system. Basically, most people should be familiar with the big hospital systems that track your electronic medical records. And we did a lot of research up front, nothing built, just research. And we came away with a series of items that were presented as definitive things that people wanted in this product. So we looked at it, and we took this lens of assumptions, and we extracted what the assumptions were. And it was interesting what happened. And then we iteratively went after to validate or invalidate the assumptions. And what we found was something that was believed to be of high value was of minimal value. Some of the patient things that they wanted that we actually didn't put much value on was much higher value. What I like about this example, and I'm not going to go through it all in detail, but is that because it was an EMR, we couldn't build within it. We couldn't build prototypes and bring them to doctors and have them check it out in the workflow in the early going. We couldn't test desirability from that perspective. What we did was we got creative. We had a lot of hospitals as clients. We asked them if we could set up a table, folding table in the cafeteria at lunchtime, and we give $20 gift cards to doctors who came over and looked at prototypes we were building. And we showed them these things, and we were low fidelity at first. We got higher fidelity over time. And that's how we understood what the product needed to do and how it needed to be, what it really needed to build before we spent significant resources in it. What was interesting, by the way, is one day the product manager, meaning me, forgot to bring the gift cards. It didn't matter. The providers, the doctors, the nurses really wanted to be involved. They saw value in what we were doing, and they wanted to make it better. So identifying assumptions. We have there's a lot of ways to do this. I'll just quickly go through an exercise that we go through. We take a version of the business model canvas. We customize the slots, and we work with the team to look at, okay, what assumptions are we making about the problem? What assumptions are we making about the solution? What assumptions about the unique value proposition? We've moved this exercise to Miro, and here's an actual client board after like a 3-hour session of going through, working with, this is developers, product people, executives, stakeholders across the board. The more the merrier. We customize the actual categories based on the client. We have a kind of a catalog of categories we pull from. So at the end of the exercise, we've identified a very complete list of all the assumptions being made. And this was about this wasn't about a new product. This particular one was just the next version of a product. We then took those stickies down and we moved them to this, and we looked each one and we looked at it through the lens that the team felt, how important is this assumption be true, and how uncertain are we about it? So you'll end up with the things that people are pretty certain about and they don't think it's that important. Then you kind of get into the category of, we definitely know these are important, but we're really certain about it. And then there's this high uncertainty, low importance, which tends to be the lightest category, but really what it is what things that end up here tend to be like, gee, we're building this new feature, but it might be interesting in another market. So it could be, there's a lot of uncertainty about that, and it's not that important, but it might eventually in another market change its state. And then this is the category that matters the most. This is where your 80% will be made or broken, is up there. It's your riskiest assumptions. You need to validate or invalidate those as rapidly as possible. I think I guess I'll get to that in a few minutes. But one thing that we're constantly asked about is, how do I prioritize better? Do I prioritize around value? Do I prioritize around WSGIF? Or, what are all these? To me, prioritize around risk. Prioritize around validating or invalidating your riskiest assumptions first. It's that upper right. This is a great way to categorize your backlog. So once we've kind of identified all of these assumptions, it's about validation. So I'm sure most people have heard minimal viable product, what it's all about. I just want to double click on that a little bit, because there's a lot of perceptions and misperceptions about that and how to leverage that. And the reason I grade product out is because we also look at minimum viable experiments as a key item in here. But from a product MVP perspective, it needs to deliver incremental value towards the overall outcome. There needs to be agreement, consensus built around the outcome and how this MVP will contribute. How is it going to be measured, right? Are there lagging indicators it's going to contribute to? And is there a channel to test it against? Those are really key things to think about from an MVP perspective. Now, I mentioned Hendrik Lyberg. I'm going to use his example again because he has some of the best examples ever, but I get a little different perspective on it. So what he looks at is the top row here, which is a team that's building a solution. Far left, they deliver something that has no value to the user, that faces the user. Second over, no value to the user. Third over, no value to the user. Finally, the user gets value in the end. Where there's this bottom row, where they're not building a solution, they're solving a problem. This team is taking a completely different approach. The problem is the user needs to get from point A to point B. What's the best way to do that? Well, let's do that in a minimally viable way and start the learning process. So there's a skateboard, it's not exactly what the user wants, but it does address the underlying need. An advanced skateboard or a scooter, a bike, a motorcycle, and then the car. So two end results, people would say, oh, the same end result. It's actually very different. every different end result, every different process in getting there, and a different team attitude. At the top, we're building a solution. At the bottom, we're solving a problem, which is the foundation of the product mindset. You're solving a problem, you're not building a solution. MVPs, I believe me, I've read about every definition, whether it's Marty Kagan or Eric Ries or Teresa Torres or whatever. There tends to be similar themes throughout. And what it is what's the lowest amount of effort to the highest amount of value, right? That's what we're after. But as we already know, because we're talked about assumptions, value is quite often an assumption. So this is where we have to get a little more creative, right? And let's look at what an MVE is. It's still low effort, but instead of focusing on value, we're going to focus on learning, right? What's the minimum amount of effort to the highest amount of learning? And we can string together very rapidly a series of MVEs that will then inform our MVP. And all of a sudden, value is, if no longer an assumption, or much less of an assumption. So another way to look at this from the idea of validating invalidating assumption is looking at value over time. And in this case, well, again, we're defining value as something that addresses the user's underlying need. In Nyberg's original diagram, it really looks like this. We over time, we build a bunch of stuff that adds no value, does not address any underlying need of the user. It just, and then all of a sudden there's a big reveal, and bang, here it is. Where the other way to think about it, where we're thinking about the underlying need and constantly adding value, there's a series of experiments that will lead up to our MVP. Another series of experiments that'll drive us to the next level, to the next level, to the next level. And over time, the M in MVP disappears because it's no longer minimal. It becomes a full-blown product. Another thing about this that I think a lot of people miss in this diagram of Nyberg's is that the end result in the two examples are different. That the bike, the one that was built through the evolving MVP process doesn't have a roof, because he implies that you're learning that from the user that they like the wind blowing through their hair when they ride a bike or a motorcycle. So they incorporated that and they learned and evolved in the final product. So it's just a little bit different take, but the key is to take assumptions and head on and validate or invalidate them as rapidly as possible. So then, and I promise you I'm getting there, 7 steps, but there's a tracking of these outputs, which drive outcomes. And that's tracking is leading indicators. And I talked about lagging indicators before. Let's go back and revisit that, because there's a true cycle of how lagging indicators feed each other. So leading indicators are early indications, that our current efforts will drive long-term product effectiveness, but they're not tried and true. Right? Eric Ries in Lean Startup calls a lot of leading indicators vanity metrics. Love the term. It's what investors or CEOs might want to hear. Increased traffic, visits up, repeat visits. But does it actually drive towards the outcome? It doesn't really. It indicates that you might be on track, but you need to go back and validate back here within the existing product. That it actually does. So that leading and lagging indicators continually feed and loop back to each other. But the winner of the race is going to be the one who focuses on the lagging indicators more. Back to the analogy, we continually learn from what's in the market through lagging indicators, and we use that to feed our new product innovations, and we use leading indicators to dictate, are we on the right track? And that's what we kind of start to learn, and things just shift over time as new product ideas flow in. So when we first started coaching this, people saying, isn't measurement upfront important? We're like, yes, but first, measurement should be focused on outcomes. output later, outcomes, because as you refine your the best way to get your outcomes, you're going to refine how you measure your leading indicators. Step 7, another complete stealing of Stephen Covey's 7th habit, which is sharpen the saw. In this case, it was a continuing nurturing of the first 6 steps. In our case, it's really continuing nurturing of alignment that comes from outcomes and autonomy, which comes from embracing uncertainty. Those two will run counter. How do you continually nurture them? And let's give an example. This is a whole, basically a, Paulo Picasso once said, good artists copy, great artists steal. We stole this from Spotify because I think it's brilliant. If you look at alignment, which we get through outcomes, or an autonomy, which we get through experimentation, companies that are low autonomy, low alignment, they're micromanaging. Their kind of culture is about micromanaging. They're in people that tend to be indifferent and head in different directions. High autonomy, low alignment, tend to be entrepreneurial, a lot of chaos, a lot of people jazzed about what they're doing, but one team's doing one thing, another team's doing another thing, and no one's aligned. The high alignment, low autonomy, welcome to the big corporation, very authoritative, conformist. People tend to do what they're told to do. You just tell me what you want and I'll do it. And then there's the high, right? Innovate and collaborative. I've only had the luxury of working in a couple of organizations over the years that were here, but it's a completely different environment. It's powerful. To kind of get more of a graphically strained example within these quadrants, if you think about, okay, we need to cross a river as a team, right? In this high alignment, low autonomy, leadership would say, we need to cross the river. I want you to build a bridge. The team's response, give us the specs. In a high autonomy, low environment, leadership, hopefully someone is working on that river problem, the team. Anyone feel like building a log cabin? Then there's the low, the worst of all, right? Leadership, do I hear running water? The team, I think my feet are wet. And high, right? Leadership, we need to keep moving to ensure everyone's safety. We'll need to cross the river. Team, we'll figure out the best way. Bridge, ferrying, boats, rope swing, who knows? And we'll keep you updated. That's really the kind of, like I said, graphically strained example. But it's a good lens to look at what we talked about earlier, right? Alignment, in this case through outcomes, and autonomy enabled through experimentation. I'm going to take a break, and I'm sure you're sick of hearing my voice, and let Becky take the reins for a minute.
So who's really driving product mindset? Although everybody plays a part in Agile, we know Scrum Masters are responsible for Agile delivery, and with good Scrum Masters, you have them driving the team, having them adhere to Scrum events and team charters, and setting the regiment to make sure the team continuously follows Agile. The Scrum team is responsible for building the right thing and building it fast, or developing the best solution for a product. And as a product owner, I'd often exclude writing the how and user stories so that I do not stifle the creativity of the Scrum team as they, do their vertical here. So then it follows that building the right thing and building the thing right, or continuous discovery, is really the responsibility of the product owner. And in order for a product mindset to really take root, the product owner must focus on outcomes rather than outputs, give the team coverage to experiment on the best solution rather than being accountable to deliver code, and ensure outcomes to align across the organization with stakeholders and other product owners.
And I think, Becky, because I want to amplify on something you really said that's really important there. And I think in terms of this group would really understand, the Scrum Master has they're really responsible for making sure Scrum is adhered to, the key events are adhered to. That's their role. They need to drive that into the organization. What we're saying here is a product owner needs to have equal responsibility in another area, which is continually making sure the team is focused on outcomes, not obsessed with outputs, not slipping into that we're building a solution. No, we're solving a problem. They also need to protect that team's ability to continually experiment. In this environment, the kind of importance of the product owner is significantly more.
So what does this look like for a product owner? So it really doesn't affect a product owner's day to day. The responsibilities that you'd expect from a product owner are really the same. The product owners doing the product discovery, they're building the roadmaps, they're maintaining the backlog and refining the backlog. They're building the stories and the epics and refining those. They're communicating within the squad and outside of the squad. They're user acceptance testing. They're doing their sprint ceremonies, but they're doing this with a product mindset. So they're building things that customers actually need rather than what the organization or the customers are telling them that they want. And so how do they do this? Dan and I often talk about this from a product owner persona called Joanna, who you can see on the right or left. And as you can see, Joanna goes through the similar motions that any team might go through. However, Joanna is tying everything back to outcomes, and she's validating her assumptions to ensure what's being built is hitting those outcomes. So for example, Joanna starts out with identifying her outcomes for the product she's building. And then she builds her backlog off of those outcomes. And she's making assumptions on what those outcomes are. And she's making a plan to validate those outcomes based on the continuous feedback loops that Dan described before. And from there, she refines her backlog to sharpen those outcomes. She's then building her product roadmap around those outcomes and using evidence from her learning to support that plan when she presents it to leadership. And so really in this model, sprint ceremonies take on an outcomes-based approach where sprint planning is centered around outcomes that Joanna and her team are hoping to achieve in the next build. Backlog refinement and Joanna's prioritization of stories centers around what's the riskiest assumptions that Joanna and her team want to validate by building an MVE. Sprint demos don't just show work completed, but they demonstrate learnings from the MVEs and how these learnings will impact future sprints. And sprint retros provide a space for Joanna and her team to not only discuss what went well and what could be improved, but also what did they learn in this sprint and what experiments went well and what can they do better next time. And so this subtle shift in the way that Joanna and her team approach sprint work and the way that Joanna approaches her responsibilities will have a greater impact and ultimately build something that the customers actually want rather than something that is either dictated to them or just assume that the customer wants.
And I think that a lot of those points that Becky just made apply also to leadership. You know, it's a very different environment, and I've actually coached this and seen it really impact when you have senior people, stakeholders, or even leadership at sprint demos, not focused on the output, but more focused on what was learned. You know, how did we learn, even if we failed, even if we learned something that didn't work, we basically had an assumption and it's invalid. That's good news. Celebrate that. To have leadership actually take that perspective is really powerful. And we've seen it, and it's a seismic shift in the way organizations run, and it really helps drive the idea of building the right things. So the 7 steps are here. One thing you can't, it is very difficult to do this one team at a time. Teams, you know, will slip back if they're trying to focus on outcomes and everyone else around them is just dragging their feet on outputs. The right side of this is really about some of the key operational maturities that need to be put in place. I mean, we have an organizational effectiveness group that Becky and I work very, very closely with from a product and organizational perspective to create the environment for this approach to really, really flourish. And I think, you know, really to wrap it up, you know, you're in the product mindset when, you know, you don't think about building solutions, you're focused on solving problems. There is going to be a time when everyone slips into into building a solution, to writing the code. Absolutely. The longer you can delay that and keep the focus on solving problems, the better off the product's going to be. You know, you're in a product mindset when you realize that true learning begins when something is built and disseminated. Real feedback comes from it. It's not enough to ask users, overall questions, or do you like this or this? There's really powerful ways to understand with low fidelity implementations, get really good information from users, really learn through that lens of desirability, viability, and feasibility. You're in a product mindset when you understand that users don't want your product. Users want the outcome they believe your product brings them, period. That's, if you take away one thing, that's important to remember. And then finally, in the product mindset, that you remember that you're asking the user to change your behavior in exchange for a different outcome. In essence, when you think about any product, new or your feature or whatever, that's what you're really doing. You're asking the user, please change your behavior. And in exchange for that, you'll get a different outcome, hopefully better. And once you start viewing things through that lens, it changes the way you approach any type of product. So,
and we have a request from the audience. If you could share again the final 7 steps.
Yes. There. This is probably, if you're gonna do a screenshot, this is the best one, because it's got I think the operational maturity on items on the side are really helpful. So, about these 7 steps, like I said, it wasn't like we set out for 7 steps. We started working, changing, altering, inspecting, and adapting, frankly, what was working and what wasn't working. And we started to realize that there was a pattern. It's different at every company. It's different. We don't implement these the same way, but these steps were consistent, right? How we identified outcomes and built consensus was different from one client to the next, but we were doing the same underlying thing. The way we identified and isolated the riskiest assumptions, again, different at every customer, every client. Cultures are different, people are different, teams are different, but we found the consistency of within each step. So what we talked about, the examples that Becky and I shared, will be different than yours, but these steps are a key kind of ladder to walk towards better outcomes. And like I said, building products that people will actually use.
Hi, Dan. This is Sai, and great presentation. Thank you so much. I have a question regarding the motorbike and the car example you mentioned.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about it, and I feel if you're making a skateboard and go with the outcome mindset, you're making tiny wheels and something along the way, you're building machinery, but it is not something that will actually be used in the car. But if you're going with the how process, you're building the wheels and the brakes, and all these components are something that you will actually be able to use in the final product. So is it something that we have to look at the solution in a certain scenario? Like, is it something that we have to think about only for new coming in a creative project, and or something when you are building a new product or something? But if I'm in a maintenance project where I already know how these things are done, and I already following the best practices in the industry or the tools, can I not go in building the right things so that my development would be faster? Or, I mean, sorry, my maintenance would be up, like, so the idea is, what are the places, what are the scenarios you have to apply this concept versus where you should avoid it, because there is no solution that fits for all, right? Can you explain on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a really, really good question. If you are a point where you're successful to a point, right, you start from that point, right? So if you already are a car manufacturer, you have a car, you start from that point. I think Nyberg's example is a little graphically strained, but let me give you a different example. Zappos, the shoe site, The founder of that, back, God, I don't even know how long ago, is great use case. But case study, what he did was he actually had this idea to sell shoes online, based on what we talked about earlier about desirability, feasibility, viability. The first thing he did was he went down to a shoe store and he said to them, will you allow me to photograph your shoes? I'm going to try to sell them on the internet. If someone buys them, I'll come back down and buy full price. That's all he did. And he did over and over again till he validated desirability. And then he moved on to now I've got desirability. Now, can I do it at a profit level? So he went back and negotiated pricing with the shoe manufacturer, started going to the manufacturer. So then it became a more viable, so he could get a markup. And then he validated viability. And then the feasibility came much later through the technology behind it. The question becomes, what's the fastest way to address that underlying need as quickly as possible? I'd be the first to admit, Nyberg's skateboard to car example is very graphically strained, but that's one of the things about it is it's easy to understand and kind of highlights it. What you're talking about is in a more advanced environment where you already have a product in the marketplace, your shifts are subtler. You're not jumping from a skateboard to a motorcycle, that type of thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. Of course, there is always, you have to look at the scenario and then address this. I see the philosophy is what really matters here, right?
Yeah.
Sure,
yeah.
I get it.
Yeah, and there's another example that I think Eric Ries uses in Lean Startup about food on the table, where they actually, CTO and president just started the company and they wanted to do some kind of food coupon that's customized to what you usually eat. And they set up a table in a supermarket and said they would, for $10 a week, we'll help you will do this. And a couple people signed up, so they would literally go to their house and sit with them and go through the flyers. And over time, they got more and more people. So they started building technology to do this rather than the old way of doing it, which is let's go build an infrastructure and then hopefully someone will want it. They validated the desirability first in very simple, rudimentary ways, and then built upon it. And what I like about that example is the way they looked at technology. It was there to alleviate bottlenecks. So they did everything they could manually to the point where they couldn't do it anymore. And then they used technology to alleviate the bottleneck. That's really what Zappos did too, right? Rather than the old way, which is let's go open a server farm and start building up that way. There's, I think pets.com did that.
Yeah, there was a very nice comment regarding the Dropbox by Dan, I think. So it is exactly explaining the.
It's funny. Dropbox. I think their first MVP was a video where they said, yes. It's actually still up, I think. And basically, the owner did a screen capture video of him using a prototype that he was thinking of building, and it got so much traction on YouTube that investors took notice and invested. So.
And we have another question from David. David, go ahead.
Okay. Big question, and it's related to the skateboard and car slide that you just mentioned, but it struck me, well, if you use the skateboard and so on, you're aiming to provide transportation. On the other hand, when you go from one to the next, you have to discard everything you built because the skateboard doesn't have any components for a motorcycle. Whereas if you do the car a little bit more and more, you can build on it, and then it's a lot less effort and less likely to go wrong. Whereas with the skateboard approach, you have to throw away the whole prototype when you move to the next stage. So there seems to be a trade-off. It isn't that the skateboard analogy is absolutely better than the development of a car.
Agreed. Absolutely agreed. And you're starting with the assumption that you're going to end up with a car, right? And from what we know in our life, yes, that we all know we're going to end up with a car. So the example is a little kind of dictated to us. But the idea that, yes, if you're doing true MVP, you're going to create disposable things along the way. But the trade-off is you're not creating permanent stuff that's not going to work, right? That's not something that's going to be desirable in the market or viable for the business. So that's really, that's the way to think about it, the trade-off. And it doesn't have to be that big of a leap. Like I said, it's a graphically strained example, right? An example that I used once, and I've heard other people repeat it. I was around 2006. I was starting to come together. I was at I was leading the website for a online content company that focused on networking equipment and did a lot of editorial around that. So people would come there to learn about networking equipment. And I noticed that whenever a editor wrote something about how to buy a server, how to buy a router, things like that, traffic would spike to it. So I had the thought, why don't we build buyer's guides? And then I stepped back and said, wait a minute, what about if I take the MVP approach? So what we did was, in an hour, we clustered a bunch of articles about buying servers, about buying routers, about buying, at the time, network attached storage. And then we wrote in the nav bar, you're looking to buy a server, question mark, looking to buy a router. It took literally about an hour. And then we watched and people clicked rapidly on, do you want to buy a server and router? All they got was a collection of articles, and then they clicked through. Engagement went up. We ended up getting, it was an MVP for a buyer's guide. We ended up getting sponsorship. Before we even built the buyer's guide, Cisco and another major company contacted us about blowing that area out and sponsoring it as a buyer's guide. It's more of the, that mentality of just trying something and seeing if it works versus, oh, I want to build a buyer's guide. Let's start designing what this is going to look like and taking our time in a few, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, whatever, 6 months later, we'll have something built. It's what's the underlying need? Let's address it as quickly as we can and see what we learn.
Hannah, Jasper, you may ask your question now.
Perfect. Yeah. So I work with a team and they built a system 8 years ago to manage inspections and audits in the company. They spent $3 million and built it, but unfortunately it was like a very cumbersome product. It was not an easy to use product. So out of the 20 auditors, only 2 or 3 of them are using the system. Now, fast forward 7, 8 years later, I need to build a system for the auditors. And I am so confused, like which functionality I should focus on. So I'm constantly going to the business and I'm saying, what would be of value for you? Do you think you can give me some tips?
Yes, I would.
Thank you.
I would start with what are the migraine headaches that they have? What are the things, the recurring problems that they have?
Awesome.
That's the place to start. The more you can understand their flow, their workflow around this. See, one thing that, it just happened at a client recently where they were like, help us, we need a better product owner. And we've got a guy who's been using our product for years. So we're going to hire him because he knows our product. And my point was, maybe he'll be great. I'm not saying don't hire him. But when product owners know the product so well, they basically end up building a product for themselves, not for all users. As what you're going to be in a situation, if you talk, I think you said you had 20 auditors. If you talk to them with a focus on understanding what are the underlying outcomes they need, you're actually going to have an omniscient perch into what's best for them because you're going to have all these different perspectives. And only you will have that, you'll have a different view than any one of them. And how you can start to see patterns of, well, these 3 people liked this idea, or they're having trouble here, where these 4 people are having issues here. Try to develop that omniscient view of the workflow, and what are the pain points in it is the place to start.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Next meeting, I'll tell you what happened.
Well, I'd love to hear.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. Aaron, you're next.
Hi, Dan. Excellent talk. I really got a lot out of it.
Thank you.
Extremely timely for me. It seems to me that the nuance here is in identifying problems that, or I can identify the big problem for for the area I'm responsible for. But the iterative approach of that slide that you showed, where you took the big problem and you translated it into a smaller problem that could be solved faster, and a smaller one and the smaller one, that seems to be where the magic is. And so what if I understand it correctly, what you're saying is find migraines that you can solve in a sprint, right? Little migraines, because the problem that I'm coming up with is, like, how to identify what minimum viable experiments are, what I'm trying to drive them towards, right? What is the scooter? I know that I have my big problem is I need transportation to work. And from there, somehow it gets shaped down into, okay, I'm going to build a scooter. And it's that translation that seems to be kind of the art part of this. Can you help unpack that a little?
Yes, well, I can try. So first of all, it's not so much solving a migraine in a sprint. As a matter of fact, I avoid talking about MVEs or MVPs in the context of sprints because it varies so rapidly. So different from where you go. But what's the quickest way to get some incremental value towards the outcome you're trying to get the user to? That's the key piece. And so let's break that into a series of smaller outcomes, or sub outcomes. We need better language. But how do you break it down to smaller sub outcomes? And how can you do something as low fidelity as possible to see if that solution will begin to work, right? It's hopefully sooner than it's more than just asking people. It's about building something, even if it's a low res, low fidelity screenshot or something like that, to start to talk through how this would impact their workflow and understand it, but always keep the understanding on the outcome that they need, right? Why are they using the product? What's the outcome? And what's the first step towards helping them towards that outcome? I mean, if we, the specific product, you can reach out to me afterward. When you talk about specific products, an easier conversation to have. Let's put it that way.
Agreed. Thank you.
Yeah.
And 2 questions from the chat. One is, how do you apply it to IT infrastructure and operational support?
Well, let me answer. I kind of have 2 thoughts on that. One is a broader question, like what we're talking about here is continuous discovery, where flowing into agile delivery. And then DevOps is continuous deployment. And I've always liked to kind of look at things through that lens, is understanding, how these 3 things. I think an organization that looks at how do we do continuous discovery in lockstep with continuous delivery and lockstep with continuous deployment through proper DevOps is a powerful combination. But specific to what I think they were actually asking is more along the lines of the same way, right? From an infrastructure standpoint, you have users, you have outcomes that those users need. You really you need to focus in on it through that lens, right? What are the outcomes? Let's identify them. Let's get, a lot of times with infrastructural initiatives, they don't have clearly defined outcomes, and that's the big problem. You know, we need to move to the cloud. We need to do this. We need to do that. But quite often, those outcomes are either maybe the overall outcome, but the more refined nuance of those outcomes gets lost. Why are they doing it? Becky, I think you have some experience in this area.
Yeah, actually, one of the clients I'm working on right now, they're building a lot of infrastructure and a lot of components that are really pretty far removed from the end customer, but you can get there. After you're asking why a bunch of times, you eventually can get there. And a lot of times too, when you think about the different choices you make in the infrastructure that you're building, why are you making those choices? There are outcomes that you're trying to achieve. You're trying to build a more resilient pipeline, or you're trying to, I'm not a developer, so I'm trying to think of some buzzwords that might help, but you're ultimately building something that a customer at some point will use, and you're building it with certain outcomes in mind to best support that customer from a security perspective or resiliency perspective. So I think it might take a few steps to get there, but when you keep asking why am I doing this? Why am I doing that? Why am I doing that? You can eventually get to your outcome.
Thank you, Becky. And there's one last question, a quick time check, say 20. One more question, Dan. How can you influence your organization when you recognize that the project you are working on is focused on solutions, not on solving problems?
And we only have 10 minutes. You know, I think it's a spectacular question. And what I find ironic about what we're talking about, you know, I've been a VP of product. I've had that lens through what I've done. What I cared about when I was at that level was outcomes. I just wasn't articulating it that way. What leadership wants is outcomes. What they tend to do is then panic and dictate outputs that they think will drive those outcomes. So what the message here to leadership is to say, you care about outcomes. We want to deliver those outcomes for you. You know, your General Patton, you tell us where to go, but don't tell us how to get there, and you'll be amazed at the results. What we need is the ability you to help us outline where we need to go. We will use the agile cadence to continually deliver every 2 weeks, indications of are we on track, are we not. So if we get off track, you'll get the 2-week check-in every 2 weeks, and you can pull us back or we can readjust. So worst case scenario, we're only losing 2 weeks. Best case scenario, we iteratively drive towards the outcomes that you want. But to do that, we need the autonomy. We need the ability to do it. And it's not in a vacuum. You will see us continually. That's kind of the message. Now, I'll be the first to admit, it takes a kind of a mature, advanced executive to be okay with that. But remember, what they want, they don't want outputs, they want outcomes. That's what they're judged on. That's what their success is going to be judged by, is outcomes, never outputs.
And to add to that, if I can, Dan,
Yeah.
We have Dan and I also have a persona named Shirley, who is a stakeholder. You met Joanna in this presentation, but Shirley is a stakeholder who's pretty against the product mindset. And I think we often see that, especially as a product owner, we have our stakeholders and they're not really bought into Agile or product mindset or any of these processes, and trying to get them on board, especially when they're at the leadership level, can definitely be a hurdle, but trying to bring them into the process as much as possible, having them define your outcomes with you, having them go through some of the validations that you do to validate, you know, what the outcome is correct. And having them participate in some of those sessions, having their feedback visibly put into the backlog in front of them, and having them see the lagging and leading indicators, and the metrics that you're tracking and the success that you're having is all really powerful to kind of help sway that group towards coming on the journey with you.
Thank you, Becky. Are there any other questions from the audience, folks?
If people have questions over time, I'm on LinkedIn. Feel free to reach out. People do all the time. I'm happy to. I have no life. I talk about this stuff all the time.
Yeah. Anand, go ahead.
Thank you.
And
Great
then,
session tonight. This is a question for both Dan and Rebecca. I'm a DevOps guy. We have a mission that's come down from our EVP to say we need to do continuous delivery. We can no longer do monolithic deployments every 2 weeks. And so his outcome has been very clearly defined. The outcome is very simple. How can we get individual teams to continually deploy features into production? It's very simple. However, what's happened is that hasn't really translated to a large organization that needs to build this, right? Because they're starting to build solutions. And we're looking at slides about how we're refining certain things and solving a lot of technical debt. But it's not really solving the problem, right? It's not really solving the problem. And I think the reason why, and this is the crux of my question, is I don't think for infrastructure teams and DevOps teams that we really have good product owners, right? Because what's happened is, so we have a DevOps senior director or cloud director or IT folks. They're getting together and they're trying to figure out how to do this. What we're not getting product owners from the product group, right? Which is a different mindset. It's a different way of thinking, right? But that thinking really focuses you to do proper epic hypotheses and things like that. And so my question is to you, Rebecca, is this something that's kind of indicative at large, where infrastructure DevOps aren't really getting that kind of product owner mindset? Because I'm scared as hell. This project is a disaster. It's an absolute disaster. Nothing has been produced. It's been 6 months. Nothing's been built.
Yeah, so actually one of the clients I'm working with right now, our product owners there came from like a very DevOps heavy background, and changing that mindset it's not easy, and it takes baby steps. And on top of that as well, at Solemn, I really play between what Dan just talked about and basic product ownership, because you really need to lay that foundation of being able to communicate through stories and epics and through business value and the why before you can really get to that product mindset. So it's definitely a journey, but I have seen improvements. I will say that you can get there, but it's not something that you can just throw some pamphlets at somebody and expect them to get there. It's really you really have to challenge them, and you really have to put some structures in place, and you really have to allow people to do validated learning, like we talked a lot about in this presentation, and allow them to do those experiments, which might not always result in the outcome that you want, but you have to provide an environment where that's encouraged. Does that help?
It helps if I had more authority. Right?
Well, I think I would just kind of amplify that. I mean, what we see a lot of is when people are doing reorganizations around Agile and things like that, especially on the technology side, DevOps area, it's like, we're not sure what to do with this person, so we'll make them a product owner. There's that kind of, it isn't, the role itself, I don't know, people don't quite understand. So it's just kind of this catch-all thing. But I agree, really good product owner training and a really good product owner will make or break whether you deliver the right thing or not.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Really enjoyed this. And Pepe, thanks for setting everything up and all the work you did.
No problem. My pleasure.